Within you lies a territory that has never been fully illuminated, a space that resists logic, where the boundaries between what is real and what is imagined slowly dissolve. Carl Jung called this place the unconscious, and within it resides everything you are, but do not yet know. It is a space that speaks with symbols, not words, that responds with dreams, intuitions, and impulses. It watches your every move, but is almost never observed. It is like a secret mind, hidden behind the mind you believe you possess. And if you think you lead your life with full awareness, perhaps you are mistaken. Most of what determines the course of your days happens there, dark room of your own mind, out you realize. The unconscious is the true architect of destiny. It shapes your fears, your choices, and even what you call luck. Jung believed that every human being is born with an invisible map within them, psychic inheritance that carries the experiences of all. It's the collective unconscious, the field where archetypes, universal images that have been repeated since the beginning of time and continue to guide our behaviors. That's why so many people make the same mistakes, love the same way, fall into the same traps. The story changes scenery, but the roles are always the same. It's no coincidence. It's ancient programming. Do you remember the first time you felt fear, guilt, or shame? These feelings haven't disappeared. They've been stored as living symbols, ready to manifest when something awakens your. The unconscious forgets nothing. The perfect silent archive governs every detail of your life. Jung said the unconscious isn't man's enemy, but a forgotten guide. When ignored, it becomes a shadow. When listened to, it becomes a master. This shadow is everything you've rejected, with impulses, desires, memories, emotions, and which now stalks you, controlling your steps through automatic reaction. It's the shadow that decides when you remain silent, when you feel angry, when you repeat old mistakes. And ironically, the more you try to escape it, the more power it gains. Now imagine that everything you believe to be the result of your will, your opinions, your tastes, your preferences, may not actually be yours. Since childhood, external voices have been programming your inner self. Parents, teachers, religions, governments, media, systems. Each one plants within you a fragment of their own worldview. Little by little, you become the result of all these influences. You believe you are choosing, but in reality, you are merely following paths that were designed for you long before you understood the meaning of your choice. This is the invisible prison of consciousness. And Jung warned, till you recognize what controls you, you will continue to call destiny what is merely repetition. There's a silent power in what's unseen. The unconscious is like a subterranean mirror reflecting everything that happens above ground. When you feel fear for no apparent reason, it's trying to warn you. When you dream of people or places you've never known, it's trying to show you what you've hidden from yourself. The modern world constantly distracts you. Voices from the outside drown out the inner. You're trained to seek outside what can only be found within. And this is how the programming remains intact. The more noise from the outside, the less you hear what the unconscious is trying to tell you. Jung believed that suffering arises when consciousness and the unconscious become too far apart. The soul is torn between what is visible and what is hidden. This is why sometimes you feel an emptiness that nothing fills. It's the inner voice asking to. The unconscious doesn't seek to punish you. It seeks to complete you. It is not darkness, but the other side of the light. Without it, life becomes mechanical, superficial, and devoid of real meaning. Integration with the unconscious is what transforms the ordinary person into a complete individual. It is the point at which the mind stops reacting. Think about how many times you've reacted automatically to a situation without understanding why. A comment that angered you more than it should have. An irrational fear that paralyzed you. A repeated choice that led you back to pain. These moments aren't coincidences. They're the language of the shadow. They're reminders of a part of you that hasn't yet been accepted. The unconscious speaks through symptoms, repetitions, and coincidences. Every time you ignore these signals, it finds another way to express itself. Crisis, failure, a relationship that forces you to see what you've denied. Nothing happens by everything is called a con. But there's something even more disturbing. Jung observed that the collective unconscious is influenceable. It can be manipulated. History shows how symbols, ideas, and emotions have been used to direct crowds. Fear, guilt, morality, patriotism, faith, powerful tools when used unconsciously. Governments, religions, corporations have all learned to shape the masses' unconscious with promises of security and belonging. And while humans believe they are thinking for themselves, they are merely repeating a collective pattern that keeps them docile and predictable. It's not force that controls them, it's invisible conditioning. You adapt, repeat, consume, obey, and call it freedom. However, there's a point where programming begins to fail. The moment you question, when the question, am I the one who decides or am I decided, arises, the unconscious trembles. First crack in the wall of unconscious, first glimmer of light in the dark room. Jung said this is the beginning of the process of individuation, the path by which a person stops being a reflection of the collective and begins to discover who they truly are. But this path requires courage. Facing the unconscious is like looking into the eyes of a mirror that reflects everything you've tried to hide. Your lies, your weaknesses, shadow. You can withstand the first contact. It's painful, but it's also liberating. It's only those who acknowledge their darkness and truly know their own. Have you ever felt that there's something inside you that silently observes everything? A presence that doesn't judge. This is the self, the spiritual center of the psyche described by Jung. It isn't the ego. It doesn't seek control, power, or validation. It seeks wholeness. Self is the part of you that was never born, and a consciousness that observes even fear itself. While the ego seeks survival, the self seeks understanding. The conflict between the two is the root of all human tension, and every time the self tries to emerge, the ego becomes frightened, feeling it will lose its throne. It's in this clash that crises occur. Anxiety, depression, existential emptiness, all are signs that the self is calling you to awake. Jung compared this process to the birth of a star. When old matter collapses in on itself, the heat of destruction ignites a new light. So it is with the human soul. When old mental structures collapse, something deeper begins to shine within, but most resist. It's easier to stay asleep and call sleep stability. Simpler to continue obeying old patterns and call it security. Yet the unconscious never tires of pushing you toward truth. It will provoke you, confuse you, and even destroy you if necessary, not out of cruelty, but out of love for wholeness. Now stop for a moment and ask yourself, who would you be if you weren't afraid of yourself? What would you do if you weren't trapped by other people? And if all external voices fell silent, what would remain? The answer will come not from reason, silence. The unconscious speaks in pauses, not in speeches. It reveals everything when you learn to hear what is unsaid. That's why Jung insisted, he who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens. Awakening is not a sudden act, but a gradual return to that which has always been there, patiently waiting. Deep down, the dark room was never the enemy. It is the cradle of consciousness. The shadow you fear is merely the light you haven't yet grasped. When you begin to see what lies behind the fear, something changes forever. The energy that once imprisoned you begins to free you. The same force that made you repeat patterns now drives you to new paths. The unconscious doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to unite you. It wants you to remember who you are before the masks, before the programming, before believing you were programmed to obey, but you were born to understand. And understanding is the first step to true freedom. This is the moment when the rational mind falls silent, unconscious begins to speak. And when it speaks, all illusion of control dissolves. It is in this instant that the inner mirror forms, Jung's mirror, where self and mystery meet for the first. The reflection may frighten, but it is real. In reality, the journey has just begun, and the dark room is about to reveal what you've kept bottled up your entire life. What comes next isn't theory, it's confrontation. Because understanding the unconscious is like turning on a light in an ancient labyrinth for the first time. The path has always been within. There comes a moment when everyone, silently, realizes something strange. The feeling that life isn't truly being lived by one, but driven by an invisible force. As if a script had already been written, and the leading role wasn't ours. You wake up, work, fulfill duties, repeat routines. You achieve goals you don't even know where they came from. Feel guilt you don't understand, and obey laws no one needed to explain. And yet you call it freedom. Jung said that modern man is not free, merely unaware of what controls him. And this truth, as simple as it is devastating, is the point at which the entire inner structure begins. The world we live in has learned to disguise domination as choice. Screens tell you what beauty is. Ads tell you what success is. Algorithms decide what you should desire. And the scariest thing is that you obey, thinking, choosing. The collective unconscious has become a giant gear, faceless mind, shaping the behavior of billions of people simultaneously. And while everyone believes they act independently, this silent force drives them in the same direction: consumption, fear, distraction. Nothing is imposed by force, because force arouses resistance. Everything is driven by suggestion. This is how programming perpetuates itself. When control is so subtle, it seems natural. Perhaps you felt this before without realizing it. That empty feeling right after an achievement. The urge to buy something just to feel like you're still in control. The constant comparison with those who seem better. Or the irrational fear of losing what you have, even when nothing is at risk. These aren't isolated emotions. They're symptoms of a mind that has learned to measure its own worth by the standards the world has imposed on it. Jung called this psychic possession, when external ideas take over the mind and make it act as if they were its own. It's the moment when the ego, seeking approval, becomes hostage to the image. He observed that contemporary human beings are increasingly distancing themselves from the soul because they have replaced being with appearance. Everything profound has been exchanged for visible. The individual has become a living showcase. You want to appear intelligent, not necessarily understanding. You want to appear happy, even when you feel like. You want to appear free, even when you obey. This dissonance between who you are and what you show creates an invisible wound. And it is from this wound that the anxiety, exhaustion, and loneliness that so many try to hide are born. Jung said that the price of denying the soul is neurosis, the constant conflict between the inner call and the outer noise. Imagine a man sitting in front of a mirror. He tries to smile, but his reflection gives a tired, distant look. He tries to convince himself he's fine, but his body doesn't believe. The words he speaks no longer represent. He senses something wrong, but he doesn't know what. So he picks up his phone, opens a social network, distracts himself. In this banal gesture, he repeats the same pattern that imprisons him, running away from himself. Millions do the same. This is the silent drama of modernity, an army of hyper-connected but internally fragmented people trying to fill a void that no image can fill. The unconscious can't stand being ignored for long. When consciousness refuses to listen, it begins to speak in another language, sometimes in the form of intense dreams, sometimes through the body, insomnia, fatigue, acts. Other times, it manifests itself in repetitive events, coincidences that accumulate like signals. Jung called this synchronicity, the way the unconscious tries to communicate with consciousness, symbolic event. You call it chance, but nothing is random when the unconscious wants heard. Phrase read by chance. Person who reappears at just the right moss that forces a change of direction. Everything seems coincidental until you perceive the hidden pattern connecting everything. Jung believed that when a person strays too far from themselves, life creates circumstances back. And almost always, this comes in the form of a breakdown. It could be an unexpected breakup, bankruptcy, illness, or burnout. It's the unconscious's way of saying, you've lost yourself. The ego calls it a tragedy. The soul calls it correction. The breakdown isn't punishment, turning point. It dismantles the structure you believed to be stable and reveals how much of it was. It's the moment when the masks fall and the mirror reveals what was always a human being searching for themselves. But there's something even deeper. Jung noted that the forces that manipulate the collective mind also operate on an individual scale. The collective unconscious carries centuries of conditioning. It whispers to you through inherited beliefs, repeated behaviors, and fears that aren't even yours. That's why you feel guilty when you want something different from what's expected of you. That's why you sabotage yourself when you're about to change. It's humanity's psychic inheritance, an instinct for obedience that was useful for survival, but has now become a prison. True freedom begins when you recognize these as ancient echoes and decide to replace them with your own inner voice. Still, breaking this programming isn't easy. The mind clings to what it knows, even if it hurts. It's the fear of emptiness, fear of feeling lost. Jung said that the first step toward individuation is to endure the void without trying to fill it. It's looking in the mirror and allowing the silence to respond. Because it's in this silence that the unconscious reveals its symbolic language, images, memories. It doesn't speak in logical order, but in sensations. When you begin to listen to it, you realize that everything that seemed like noise begins to make sense. What once seemed like failure reveals itself as direction. What once seemed like misfortune reveals itself as an opportunity for growth. There's a curious detail. Jung said that human consciousness is like an island in the vast ocean of the unconscious. Every time you believe you're in control, the sea rises and shows you otherwise. The tides of the unconscious mind are subtle but uncontrollable. A forgotten memory can change your mood. A word can awaken an old pain. A look can ignite the desire to escape. All these are waves of the same internal ocean trying to reach the surface. The mistake is to fight the sea, when what the soul is asking for is to learn to sail. Sometimes life does this to you. It pushes you into an emotional storm until you realize you can no longer pretend. That's when the search begins, not for external answers, for internal understanding. And what once seemed like a breakdown becomes a rebirth. The mind begins to recognize the signs, the patterns, the symbols. Coincidences become guides. Fears become portals. And every pain becomes a reminder of what still needs to be integrated. The unconscious stops being an enemy and becomes a map. But Jung also warned, the process of awakening is not linear. Each step brings new layers of shadow to light. And the more light you illuminate, the more you realize how much there is still to illuminate. Therefore, the inner path requires patience. The ego wants to understand everything, but the soul only wants to feel. Wisdom is not born from a quick answer, but from living with the mystery. When When you accept that not everything needs to be controlled, something within you relaxes. And in this relaxation, the unconscious finally begins to. The rational mind asks, why is this happening to me? The awakened mind asks, what is this trying to teach me? It is in this shift in perspective that external control loses its power. Life ceases to be something that happens against you and becomes something that happens. The world remains the same, but the way you see it changes radically. Fear becomes a compass, pain, a teacher, repetition, a message, and each small moment, however banal it may seem, becomes a sign of something much greater operating silently. Ultimately, Jung didn't teach us to master the unconscious, but to dialogue with it, to listen to what silence is trying to say, to recognize that consciousness is not the mountaintop, but a window to an infinite inner universe. Everything you experience, every relationship, every conflict is. The world doesn't speak with words, it speaks with symbols, and these symbols are the language of the soul. You begin to understand them, you discover that you have never been alone. There is a deep intelligence guiding your steps, trying to remind you of the way home. And that's where the mystery deepens. Because the more you understand the unconscious, the more it changes shape. It moves like a liquid mirror, reflecting exactly what you're ready to see. The question is, what will happen when you're truly ready to see it all? What will remain when the masks fall away? That's the question the unconscious leaves hanging, the question that will open the next door in the lab. There are times when life seems to silently crumble. Nothing explodes out of nowhere, but everything unravels from within. Plans lose meaning. What once made sense now tired, and the body seems to carry a weight that comes from nowhere. It's the kind of collapse that doesn't announce itself. And when it arrives, the ego calls it a crisis, but Jung would call it a calling. Because there's something in the soul that only awakens when everything that was comfortable begins to hurt. Ruin for the unconscious is not the end, it is the beginning of the process of individuation, the point at which the human being is forced to stop acting and fight. The rational mind tries to resist. It wants to return to the familiar, rebuild the old, mend what has collapsed. But the unconscious won't allow it. It knows that certain structures must fall to make room for what is. Jung said that human beings transform only when forced to, when the pain becomes unbearable and consciousness can no longer pretend not to see. The fall is the instrument of awakening. It is the moment when the unconscious takes the reins and says, now, you will listen to me. What he says isn't pleasant. He exposes the lies you've told yourself, the dependencies disguised as love, the fears hidden behind responsibilities. He dismantles your narrative with surgical precision. Everything that was certain becomes doubt, and everything that was ignored begins to rob. It's at this point that many give up, believing they're going crazy. But it's not madness, it's revelation. Inner chaos is the price of the truth that was dormant. But what happens when consciousness begins to expand beyond its capacity? When old explanations no longer suffice, and the world loses its coherence? Jung saw this as an essential stage, disorientation as a rite of passage. Just as gold must pass through fire, the psyche must shatter to collapse, soul's furnace. It is there that the surface burns away, and or reveals itself. Suffering, then, ceases to be an enemy. It becomes the fusion point between who you were and who you are about to become. What if the destruction you fear is actually the only possible formation? What if everything you call failure is merely resistance to the new trying to be born? This is the question the unconscious whispers while the ego screams for control. Life, at this stage, seems cruel, but it is simply obeying the natural law of growth. Nothing evolves without loss. The old must die for the new. Pain is the birth of consciousness. There comes a moment when human beings realize bridges are burned, and what was once shelter becomes ruin. It is the point of no return. Jung saw this as the crossing of the shadow, the inevitable encounter with all that has been. It is in this darkness that the unconscious reveals its oldest and most powerful images. Intense dreams emerge, symbols recur. The rational mind tries to interpret, but the meaning lies not in the words. Experience. Each symbol is a key, and each key opens an inner door. Sometimes the unconscious manifests itself with almost poetic precision. A person appears in your life to represent what you don't want to see. A relationship ends at the exact moment you need solitude. An unlikely event forces you to abandon a path that no longer made. It all seems like coincidence, but it's synchronicity, the secret language of the soul in action. Jung believed that when consciousness aligns with the unconscious, the universe responds, not as magic, but as a coherence between inside and outside. What you feel begins to shape what you experience. The process is demanding. It demands total honesty. It forces you to admit that the suffering you feel doesn't come from others, but from your own refusal to grow. The unconscious doesn't punish, it just shows. And what it shows can be brutal. It reveals how much you sabotaged yourself, how much you gave up on yourself to fit in. At first, this feels like humiliation. Then it becomes relief, because for the first time you understand that the pain had meaning, guiding you back home. How many times have you tried to erase a feeling simply because it didn't fit the image you wanted to maintain? How many times have you stifled an intuition because it contradicted what others expected? Every time you do this, you weaken your own soul. The unconscious doesn't want perfection, it wants wholeness. It wants you to recognize both the light and the shadow. Denying the shadow is denying half of yourself. And as long as that half is rejected, it will continue to control your life behind you. The shadow is the mirror where the ego sees everything it cannot. It is the accumulation of everything that is repressed: anger, desire, envy, power, sensitivity. But within it also lies its unlived potential strength, creativity, the instinct for truth. That's why Jung said that integrating the shadow is the beginning of healing. Not about eliminating the darkness, but about transforming it into fuel for the light. Consciousness is not born from what is pure, but from what has been purified. At this point, the process becomes almost mystical. Something within you begins to silently shift. Your perception expands. Repetitions cease. Coincidences increase. You begin to perceive a subtle order behind the apparent chaos. It's as if a hidden intelligence coordinates everything for your growth. And indeed, it does. The unconscious is the bridge between the human and the eternal. It is not a simple repository of memories. It is the very matrix of inner reality. What you call self is only the visible part of this immensity. But what would happen if this force began to manifest itself fully, without filters? What would become of a mind fully aware of its depths? Perhaps this is the true human fear, not the fear of failure, but the fear of power itself. The unconscious holds possibilities so vast that reason is terrified by them. Becoming conscious is also assuming responsibility and density. That's why few follow through. It's more comfortable to live in the shadows than to bear the full light. Those who allow themselves to continue to discover something surprising. Crisis becomes a source. Pain becomes creative energy. What was once a wound is a portal. The unconscious, once feared, becomes an ally. Intuition is refined, dreams gain direction, and life begins to respond. Nothing becomes easy, but everything becomes more real. Suffering doesn't disappear, but it changes function. It ceases to be punishment and becomes expansion. Ultimately, understanding the unconscious isn't about controlling it. It's about learning to listen to it. And this listening requires humility. Same humility of someone who recognizes they know nothing about themselves. Jung said that modern man lost his soul because he stopped listening to what comes from within. Recovering it, like rekindling an ancient flame. It's about feeling, for the first time, that there's something inside you that time has never touched. And then comes the quietest, most transformative revelation. Everything you sought outside was always inside, waiting to be seen. Chaos was merely the messenger, ruin, the portal, the unconscious, the teacher, and you, the apprentice who had to lose yourself to finally begin to see. There's an almost imperceptible moment. Human perception shatters. Reality, once solid and predictable, seems to crumble into tiny cracks, and something invisible begins to escape through them. It's at this moment that the unconscious finds a way to express itself. Jung said that the external world is not a stage, but a mirror. Everything we see, admire, or reject in others is a symbolic extension. Most problem is that almost no one realizes. People believe they see the truth, when in fact they are only seeing their own projections reflected in the world. And this is where the most subtle art of all is born. Psychic camouflage. Humanity has become accustomed to living among masks. The persona, that social version of self that dons positions and smiles, was created for humankind to survive among other humankind. But the more one identifies with it, the further one distances oneself from the soul. Jung observed that the danger of the persona lies in its becoming a prison, when the image ceases to protect and begins to replace the true self. This is how someone can spend years playing roles, forgetting who they truly are. Modern society is built on this collective theater. Each individual plays a role with such conviction that even the unconscious begins to believe in the character. The curious thing is that this dynamic isn't just psychological, biological. Recent neuroscience studies show that the human brain reacts to social masks as if they were real. When someone repeatedly lies about who they are, the brain adapts its emotional circuits to support this new version. The lie becomes a functional truth. The psyche, to avoid collapse, begins to edit memories and emotions that contradict the persona. Thus, the human being creates a second self, a self-sufficient but fragile projection. It survives as long seen. The gaze of others becomes oxygen. This is why social media serves as nourishment for the ego. They are modern temples of the persona, where image is more important than presence. But the unconscious doesn't allow itself to be fooled for long. It begins to manifest small ruptures, identity crises, chronic fatigue, a feeling of emptiness. It's as if the self, the true center of the psyche, is trying to break through its shell to breathe. Jung described this process call of wholeness. The soul tries to correct the imbalance, and it does so by sending signals through dreams, coincidences, unlikely encounters. When the ego ignores these signals, the unconscious intensifies the symptoms. The mask begins to crack. A man once recounted how he spent 20 years pretending to be confident and impenetrable. He was an admired executive, always in control, always rational, until the day when, for no apparent reason, he began to cry in the middle of a meeting. Not out of sadness, but out of exhaustion. He said that in that instant, he felt as if he were melting. All the roles, titles, and gestures that defined him dissolved, and he stood before himself, fragile and ill. In the following months, he left his position and began studying psychology. He discovered that this rupture was what Jung called a confrontation with the shadow, the inevitable encounter with the repressed part of himself. It was the collapse of the persona. But not everyone recognizes this process. Most try to restore the mask as quickly as possible. They take medication, move to another city, pretend nothing happened. And so the cycle repeats itself. Society offers sophisticated distractions for those trying to escape themselves: entertainment, consumption, productivity. Also, no one has to look within. It's a collective form of camouflage. Modern man masters technology, but fears his own soul. He knows how to measure the distances between planets, but cannot bear the silence of his own. There's something paradoxical about it. The more people try to hide their vulnerabilities, the more predictable they become. The uniformity of masks creates a visible, almost mechanical pattern. This is why certain individuals seem to read others with ease, not because of a mystical gift, but because they see beyond the persona. Jung believed that intuition arises when consciousness learns to decode the signals of the conscious, seeing what lies behind appearances, act of lucidity. But to do so, one must first recognize one's own masks. A curious fact about human behavior has been observed in social psychology studies. When someone enters a new environment, they spend the first 30 seconds observing whoever seems to dominate the space. Subconsciously, they seek out the role model to imitate. Within minutes, they adopt the same tone of voice, same posture, and even similar facial expression. The unconscious is programmed to adapt because it perceives rejection as a threat to survive. This tendency creates a kind of psychic contagion. You blend into the environment without realizing it and gradually become a reflection. Individuality disappears in the unconscious search for acceptance. But something extraordinary happens when someone decides to stop acting. The silence that once frightened begins to reveal new perceptions. It's as if reality takes on a new texture, clearer, more vivid. Jung said that when an individual frees themselves from the persona, the world around them becomes symbolic. Everything begins to have meaning. Rain isn't just water. Purification. An unexpected encounter with a stranger brings a message. A forgotten object carries memories that spark new ideas. Life begins to speak in code, and the unconscious becomes a translator. There was a case Jung reported in his studies. A patient dreamed of a large golden serpent slowly encircling her. In the dream, she felt no fear, only a strange sense of recognition. In the following months, she faced a series of losses, family, professional, and emotional, but said that for the first time she did not feel destroyed. On the contrary, she felt whole. The serpent, a universal symbol of transformation, had appeared as an omen of the symbolic death of the ego. She silently understood that she was not being punished, but renewed. The unconscious had announced the metamorphosis even before reason realized. This kind of manifestation seems far-fetched to the rational, but Jung argued that the unconscious operates through synchronicities, events that connect by meaning, not cause. A person thinks of someone they haven't seen in years and suddenly receives a message from that. Symbol repeats itself in different places until its presence becomes impossible to ignore. Chance, or the unconscious, is merely a way of disguising the hidden order. When the individual becomes attentive, they begin to realize that life is less random than it seems. And what does all this have to do with camouflage? Everything. Because the unconscious, unlike the ego, doesn't need to protect itself. It's the observer behind every mask. When you learn to live in touch with this dimension, camouflage becomes a tool, not a prison. You begin to choose what you show instead of being a slave to what you hide. Speaking less, acting with presence, serving without haste, all of this transforms the way people perceive you. Power lies not in exposing, but in knowing what to present. There's something almost artistic about this. People who radiate mystery, calm, or authority aren't necessarily more intelligent or charismatic. They've simply learned to align their unconscious and consciousness. When they speak, what they communicate goes beyond words. It's the energy of integrity that manifests coherence between what they feel, think, and Jung called this symbolic integration. It's the moment when the human being ceases to be a fragment and becomes a presence. Perhaps that's why some figures in history seem to exert fascination even centuries later. Not because they were perfect, but because they carried this silent power of authenticity. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, was seen as enigmatic because he never fully revealed his intentions. Einstein spoke simply about the cosmos, but left gaps that invited mystery. Jung believed that the aura of these men came from the harmony between the persona and the unconscious. They didn't hide. They revealed enough to awaken the invisible in others. What would happen if each person learned to live this way, aware of their own depth and self-image? The world would become less manipulable. Fear would lose its market value. The void would not be filled with distractions. Power then would cease to be domination and would become natural influence, the strength of one who is whole. Jung said that a true leader doesn't command, but attracts, because those who are at peace with their own unconscious exude security. And security is the most magnetic vibration there is. Ultimately, the entire art of mental camouflage boils down to a choice. Do you want to remain seen, or do you finally want to start seeing? Conscious observation is key. When you observe without judgment, other people's masks become transparent, and your own begins to dissolve. It is at this point that the illusion falls, and the invisible reveals itself. Life begins to work with you, not against you. Everything changes when the unconscious ceases to be the enemy. It becomes the silent director who arranges the scenes of your existence. Coincidences, encounters, and even obstacles take on new meaning. Reality ceases to be a stage and becomes a living mirror. And then, for the first time, you understand, there is no more perfect disguise than the truth spoken calmly. Because those who are whole don't need to hide. They simply exist. There comes a point in the inner journey where everything becomes too dangerous to retreat, and too late to pretend nothing happened. Consciousness has already been opened, veil has fallen, and there is no going back to the old comfort of ignorance. The ego, desperate, tries to rebuild its walls, but something within you has already broken free. It's as if an ancient part, silent, deep, and observant, has awakened and now looks at the world with new eyes. And this new perception comes at a price, seeing what was previously invisible, including within oneself. This is where the unconscious reveals the final lesson. It is not enough to know it. It must be mastered, transformed into an ally, not a master. Jung said that man does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making darkness conscious. That is what begins now. The first enemy is fear itself. It returns in disguise, more subtle, more intelligent. It is no longer the irrational dread of childhood. Now it manifests doubt. It hides in the questions. What if I'm wrong? What if all this is in vain? What if I lose what I've gained? Fear is cunning. It knows how to disguise itself as prudence. And when it does, it even seems reasonable. The mind begins to negotiate with the unconscious, trying to impose logic where there's only mystery. But mystery does not bend. It demands surrender. Fear wants control. The unconscious wants trust. Only when you stop struggling to understand everything and begin to feel the flow within, does fear lose its power. At this point, life begins to reconfigure. People disappear for no old situations dissolve. An invisible cleansing is taken. At first glance, it seems like loss, but it's a realignment. The unconscious, now awakened, begins to adjust reality to reflect the new vibration of consciousness. Everything that isn't true falls away. This is frightening. It seems like the world is falling apart, but in reality, it's the illusion that's being shattered. Jung said that the psyche has a natural drive toward wholeness, an autonomous movement that leads the individual toward who they truly are. Consciousness cooperates, this movement accelerates. When it resists, crises are. But there's a danger at this stage. Some confuse expanding consciousness with personal power. They think that understanding the unconscious is controlling it. They try to manipulate people, predict destinies, and force outcomes. And that's when the shadow returns in a new guise. The ego, now more sophisticated, uses knowledge as a tool of domination. This is the ultimate temptation, believing that wisdom entitles one to control others. Jung warned that those who try to govern the unconscious instead of dialoguing with it end up dominated by it. True power lies not in influencing, remaining centered. A man once came to Jung claiming he had achieved a state of lucidity so profound that he could sense. He believed he was ready to guide. Jung listened silently and replied, "If you believe you have mastered the unconscious, it is because you have not yet truly known it." Jung explained, the unconscious was not made to be conquered, but to be understood. Whoever tries to rule it will be destroyed by it. Whoever respects it. Months later, this same man had an emotional breakdown. He discovered he had transformed self-knowledge into arrogance. When he surrendered, he finally began to understand what true control is internal, not external. What if everything you call failure is actually a test of integrity? What if every obstacle is the unconscious testing your coherence, asking if you really are who you say you are? Awakened consciousness isn't a medal, it's a responsibility. Because now, every choice carries weight. There's no longer the comfort of blaming the world. What happens outside reflects what's happening inside. The unconscious is no longer a hidden shadow. It's the mirror that reveals every detail. It shows how much you still lie, how much you still run away, how much you still try to appear out of being. From this point on, lying hurts because it destroys the bridge between mind and soul. The pace accelerates. Life seems to test your new awareness at every unexpected conflicts erupt. People trigger old repeated situations reappear, but now you notice something different. The scenario is the same, but you are no longer the same. Your unconscious observes, as if to know if you have learned your lesson, and suddenly something changes. You don't react. You just breathe, feel, understand. And what once dominated you loses its power. It is in this moment that true mastery begins. Power lies not in conquering the world, but in overcoming the reflex it provokes within you. Tension increases because the ego, even transformed, still fears disappearing completely. It wants to participate in the light, wants to feel part of the new inner order. Self, the psychic totality, not negotiate with fragments. When integration begins, the ego feels as if it is dying. But what dies is only the illusion of separation. What is born is balance. It is as if an invisible bridge unites everything that was once conflict, the rational and the intuitive, the conscious and the unconscious, the good and the evil. Nothing is eliminated. Everything is reorganized. This is what Jung called individuation, the process by which the human being becomes. However, before the peak, there is always one final test. It is the moment when the unconscious demands total surrender. Something unexpected happens. A loss, a disillusionment. The ground disappears once everything that seemed like an achievement dissolves. It seems like a punishment, but it is the ultimate test. The human being must prove that they no longer depend on control to exist. It is the leap into the void. And when they finally let go, something sustains them. Trust is no longer a concept, it is experience. Fear disappears because the meaning of existence changes completely. The external world remains chaotic, but the inner core is at peace. The mind quiets. The body becomes an extension of soul. Thoughts, once chaotic, align with intuition, ceases to be an exception and becomes everyday language. Coincidences multiply. Signs become clear. Life begins to flow, as if the universe responded directly to one's inner state. There is no longer searching, there is attunement. It is as if reality itself has shifted frequency. Jung said that when the self awakens, external life bends to internal harmony. The unconscious and conscious become one mind, and the human being finally becomes the creator of their experience. But this isn't the end. It's the beginning of another kind of existence, lighter, deeper. The world continues with its noises. People continue with their masks. Now you see them from the outside. Nothing holds you back anymore because you recognize the game. You don't need to win it, just understand it. True mastery is silent. It doesn't flaunt itself, it doesn't explain itself, it simply is. You become presence. Presence is power. Jung's journey was never about perfection, but about integration. And in the end, what seemed like a struggle between light and shadow was simply the natural process of the unconscious was not an enemy, mirror. Fear was not an obstacle, it was the guardian of the shadow was not evil, it was dormant power. Everything was on the same side, the side of wholeness. The destiny was not to be free of the unconscious, but to be free with it. And when this understanding sets in, silence returns. But it's a different silence, not that of emptiness, but of plenitude. The gaze expands, time slows down, everything seems to vibrate in unison. It's the moment when human beings realize there was never a path to be traveled, only an interior to be discovered. And what they find there is something they've always been waiting for. The balance between what they think, what they feel, who they are. It's the first breath of true freedom. There comes a moment, after every search, silence ceases to be absence and becomes a response. Human beings come to understand that the inner journey was never about something outside, but about recognizing what was always there, patiently waiting to be seen. After traversing fear, staring into the shadow, and enduring the collapse of their own identity, simple clarity emerges. The unconscious never, and it was the forgotten part of the same self that tried to survive. Every struggle, every pain, and every escape had only one purpose: to remind you of who you truly are. Jung said that man heals his soul not by the light he adds, but by the darkness he accepts. And this is what defines the end and the new beginning of this journey. The moment when human beings stop denying what they feel and begin to live with total presence. Now, knowledge needs to become practice. Not enough to understand the unconscious. You need to establish a constant dialogue with it. Application begins with the simplest gestures. When a repetitive thought arises, instead of fighting it, observe it. Ask, what do you want to show me? When you feel fear, don't try to erase the feeling. Breathe and ask, where does this come from? Does it all make sense? When an intense emotion overwhelms you, don't run away. Allow it to express itself without judgment. The unconscious doesn't speak in words. It speaks through symbols, through reactions, through energy. Every discomfort is a messenger, and when you listen to it attentively, it transforms into insight. Thus begins the process of integration, not through force, but through listening. The practice continues in walk with greater awareness. Notice the environment, the sounds, small repetitions. Life speaks to you constantly, but haste makes you observe the patterns. The same situations recur, there's something the unconscious still wants to teach. Nothing repeats itself without reason. A persistent mistake is a lesson ignored. When consciousness learns, the cycle ends. This is the true miracle of transformation. Realizing that reality changes when the mind changes. What was once an obstacle becomes a sign. What seemed like bad luck turns out to be protection. The awakened mind doesn't seek control, it seeks understanding. And there's a quiet discipline to this new way of living. Jung believed that humankind only becomes whole when it makes introspection. This means creating moments of stillness every day, even if only for a few. Turning off distractions, taking a deep breath, and what in me is still trying to be heard. Gradually, you'll begin to feel the difference between the noise of the ego and of the unconscious. The ego shouts, demands, cares. The unconscious whispers, suggests, goes. It doesn't force, it just waits. And the more you listen, the clearer the direction becomes. The second stage of the practice is to recognize the symbolic presence in everything. Jung said that the soul expresses itself through images. This means that the world is a dynamic mirror, always sending back messages. A song that plays at the right moment, an unexpected encounter, a phrase that moves you. None of these are coincidental. Synchronicity is the language through which the unconscious communicates with it. To perceive it, you must. The more attentive you are, the more you will realize that life is coordinating its steps with almost magical precision. When the inner and outer align, possible dissolves. But awakening also brings responsibility. Now you know that every repressed emotion creates a shadow. Every cultivated thought shapes the reality. The unconscious responds to coherence. There's no point in talking about evolution and harboring resentment. There's no point in longing for light and cultivating fear. Everything you vibrate, you amplify. Therefore, inner work is daily. It's about consciously choosing what you want to multiply. If the world seems chaotic, it's because humanity has projected its own collective chaos onto it. Change begins with each individual. A single, peaceful individual silently transforms the space they live in. There's immense power in living truthfully. When you stop lying to yourself, the entire external structure reorganizes. People move away, paths open, opportunities arise. It's as if the universe responds to the new frequency, and it does. Because the unconscious doesn't separate inside and outside, it creates bridges. Every thought that arises within you manifests in some way in the world. Therefore, keep your mind clear, not for moral reasons, psychic hygiene. Taking care of your thoughts is taking care of your own reality. But perhaps the most transformative step is forgiveness. Not the forgiveness that erases, forgiveness that understands. Forgiveness is freeing yourself from the need for the past to be different. It's accepting that each person, including yourself, acted from the level of consciousness they possessed at the time. The collective unconscious is made of pain, fear, and survival. Breaking this cycle is an act of spiritual courage. When you forgive, you not only heal a story, but also the field around it. The unconscious expands with each act of compassion. And then something new emerges, a sense of profound serenity, even amidst chaos. It's the sign that the self, true center of the psyche, is in command. You begin to live from the inside out, no longer a hostage to circumstance. Power lies not in controlling events, but in choosing your stance toward them. This is true freedom, psychological freedom. From it, the impossible begins to end. You don't need to change the entire world, just change the way you observe it. The rest follows. There is, however, a final revelation, one that few have the courage to accept. Everything you sought, peace, purpose, love, power, was always you. The journey that seemed external was, from the beginning, a journey inward. The unconscious, with all its shadows and fears, is merely the other side of the same. The hero you hoped would come to save you is the same one now reading these. When this realization sets in, the search ends, and silence returns no longer as emptiness, wholeness. If this message touched something within you, it's because your unconscious recognized the truth behind the words. Don't ignore this call. Allow yourself to continue the process. Start today. Write about what you feel, observe your own patterns, talk to your emotions, practice forgiveness presence. Don't wait for the perfect moment. The moment is now. Transformation doesn't happen all at once, but begins the moment you choose to listen to yourself. Awareness isn't a destination, it's a daily practice. And if in some way this video awakens something in you, a memory, a question, a spark, share it. Even if silently, even anonymously, write in the comments what you felt. This is how knowledge transforms into movement, and movement into collective awakening. Like the video, it made you think. And subscribe to the channel to continue this journey with us. Because the path of consciousness doesn't end, it simply changes form. The next stage begins when you decide to remain awake.